Hello, everybody. Today we're going to talk about advanced visions of paradise. Before I get into it, the query of the day is Pure Land consciousness. What is Pure Land consciousness? I should first introduce you to basically the, 6 Buddhist realms, which is one way of, in a sense, breaking down the possible kind of attractors of consciousness. Like if you were to map the transition probability between different states of consciousness and the kind of like limit cycles or attractors that emerge, perhaps like this might be a good lens of kind of how to interpret those attractors. And I highly recommend this book, Opening the Heart of Compassion. It's a wonderful, wonderful kind of like overview of the 6 Buddhist realms, and in what way, they can be extremely sneaky. They can manifest in how we think, how we feel. And whenever you are in one of these Buddhist realms, you tend to be, in a sense, completely stuck in it, because the frames that you use in order to, in a sense, do state transitions come from that realm. And in a sense, they are closed rooms. They seem at times like they have kind of a deep insight into the entirety of consciousness and the universe, but in some sense might be kind of a bit of an echo chamber in some interesting way. And I will, in a sense, like talk about these 6 Buddhist realms as I go through various visions of paradise. But it is worth pointing out that, in a sense, maybe 99.999% of, states of consciousness, human beings, are, in a sense, like in one of these like 6 Buddhist realms. But you can also be outside of them. You can actually be free, which is you can be in a state of being, a state of consciousness that is not actively engaging in, activity related to one of these Buddhist realms. And instead, they are, in a sense, able to perceive them as options, as kind of like a menu of consciousness, and notice the pros and cons objectively without getting wrapped up or seduced or, in some sense, embedded within any of those spaces. And that is a wonderful place to be, because it's free, it's unbiased, it's capable of ultimately really telling, what is good and bad about them. And that would be, roughly speaking, maybe the state space of experience of, bodhisattvas, very advanced meditators, some exotic states of consciousness might have kind of that flavor, maybe like, for example, 5-MeO DMT, and maybe to some extent, some things like, MDMA or things of that sort may give you a temporary glimpse of, what might be kind of outside of the 6 Buddhist realms. And to some extent, a lot of what I'm going to talk about will be best absorbed, best thought of. It's going to be the most useful to you if you understand it as, in some sense, kind of like the work of, people who've been trying to figure out the way. I mean, in a sense, actually gaining control over states of consciousness and not be completely wrapped up into any of these limit cycles. I'll also mention that basically, a vision of paradise requires an aesthetic. Because if you want to carry out basically a vision of paradise, you need to coordinate with other people. You need a shared, very kind of like fast, parallel, decentralized, very, very efficient way of, in a sense, tagging events or situations that happen, and, in a sense, like quickly get a sense of like whether they're compatible with the overall picture or aesthetic. So, in a sense, like, when we reason about the future, when we reason about like, what could be a good, utopia, so to speak, there is this, we're doing things on multiple levels. Like, on the one hand, you're using an ontology, you're using kind of like a sense of what is real, what is good, what kind of frameworks are adequate in order to understand what is good and what is real, on the one hand. But then also you're cultivating an aesthetic, which is you're, in a sense, figuring out a way to feel about images and about concepts and about situations. And it kind of like, settles down into a coherent structure that might, we might describe it as a kind of like a self-perpetuating aesthetic. Now, aesthetics, it's very loosely defined for the most part. I have an article on, 8 models of art that I recommend reading to kind of like show you, how tricky it is actually to know like what an aesthetic is fundamentally. But I really like the work of Rob Bourbia, a great meditation teacher, Dharma teacher that I've been basically reading and consuming his work recently. And the way in which he describes an aesthetic is as follows. So basically there are 3 components to it at the very least, in the simplest formulation. The first one is eros. And eros is related to kind of like sexual energies and arousal, but it's not quite it. It's a generalization of it. It's passion. It's, in a sense, the desire to get closer to the images to which you're attracted to the images, the sensations, the archetypes. And in a sense, cultivating an aesthetic involves, in a sense, cultivating that passion towards those archetypes. And, the archetypes could be like very, in a sense, low level or very high level, very abstract things. Like, for example, justice and beauty and intelligence and things of that sort, or something much more basic, like, a walk on the beach or something like that. Like maybe that is a key part of your aesthetic, or like, pictures of nature or something like that. In either of these situations, though, for it to, qualify as an aesthetic, you require strong passion, have these beautiful resonant reverb of experience when you actually evoke those images so that you can savor them. And that's one part. Another part is that you also requires what he might describe as like psyche, which is the collection of images, the archetypes, the things that you're attracted to. And there's kind of this dialogue between eros and the psyche. And finally, you also need logos. And logos is the overarching conceptual framework that makes sense of the psyche. Because, particular ideas, like even, for example, what is an atom? Something very, very simple. What is an atom? Your conception of it is very, very different as a function of basically how you have filled in the details of reality, your model of reality. Like an atom is a very, very different entity for a, particle physicist who knows quantum field theory relative to, somebody in elementary school who just learned about atoms and maybe hasn't even been taught that there's electrons and protons and quarks and so on. So in a sense, like the logos allows you to organize these images and pictures and concepts within an overarching framework. And an aesthetic is actually the simultaneous coexistence of eros, psyche, and logos, painting basically a picture of what is the good. And the thing is that this is something that ultimately gets implemented with hedonic tone, with valence, with quote-unquote vibing. In a sense, is cultivating a way of vibing where particular situation and images give you these beautiful resonant reverb quality to the soul, so to speak. And in that sense, a lot of the times many disagreements that happen between people, maybe at the intellectual level, they share ideas and concepts and background assumptions, but if they've been cultivating very different aesthetics for many years, there's things that they might say that, within their semantic web, within their logos, or maybe the kind of eros that they have been cultivating, like something that is factual, something that is true, may not be possible to absorb within one aesthetic. Maybe even if intellectually, it's true or it's correct, if it doesn't fit within kind of this web of harmony and consonance between the various elements of your aesthetic, is going to be dissonant and unpleasant. And it's quite interesting that I think a lot of the times when people disagree, actually they agree on the object level. It's just that their aesthetics are different and they don't know that. And it's not obvious. And also because of naïve realism, whenever you experience something dissonant, it feels like it's inherently bad. So yeah, when somebody says things that go against your aesthetic, that might actually feel fundamentally very unpleasant. And in that sense, like, it's involuntary. And I would definitely suggest equanimity here for this talk, if not in general, where, notice discomfort with whatever I might say. Perhaps you agree with it at the object level, but you may say something like, well, it doesn't quite check. And my claim is that it's actually because it's causing a little bit of dissonance with your implicit aesthetic. And most people have implicit aesthetics. They're not, they don't have a theory of their aesthetic laid out. They haven't gone that far for the most part. So that's a super important thing. The overall way in which I'm going to organize this video is by talking about these hypothetical camps in maybe a cool event. We might call it, like the super happiness festival. And this is something that it's not only me, we've been working on it for quite a while now. In 2020, we had like a pretty big like internship cohort, and one of the groups of that internship cohort focused on basically creating a QRI online book, which basically binds together a lot of like the core works in an order that will allow you to essentially consume them and hopefully understand all of it, because it's basically building up to kind of this worldview. But also we introduced a piece of a new narrative, in a sense, that organizes the various articles and ideas in a way that, put them within a broader kind of logos, or maybe meta logos, because each of these might have its own logos, so to speak. So yeah, huge thanks and congratulations to Wendy, Ellen, Hunter, Tanvi, and Zuck and Mike, who have contributed to this effort. I'm probably blanking on somebody else, but essentially we will be releasing this book really soon, and I'm very excited about it. So keep in touch. Stay posted. We will publish it pretty soon. And from that book, basically the thing that is building towards, which we will get at the end of this video, is Camp Paradise Engineering. And this is art by, this is like the Tower of Paradise Engineering. The artwork is made by Wendy. So many thanks, Wendy. And Mackenzie made this pin, and she ordered basically some of the art in this format, which is fantastic. I also wanted to thank really quick Mackenzie, Sean, Quinton, and Zuck for all of their work in general to help QRI further its mission, its aesthetic, and its understand it and advanced science. And they gifted me this very beautiful coral necklace, which I wear very proudly, and it will have a non-trivial connection with one of the camps, as I will be describing them in a second. Okay, so what are these camps? What is this advanced visions of paradise? And I know that, saying that our visions are advanced is very arrogant, because, that's a relative term. What does it say? What does it mean to say that, for example, a technology is advanced? It's obviously some kind of like bold social movement, move. It's not like describing it, objectively in a sense. It's a relative term. So honestly, we are bold enough to claim that, the conversation that we're having right now about, hey, what paradise should be like or could be like, these are very advanced ideas. Basically, mainstream discourse, even, futurists, the most, Nick Bostrom, David Pierce, Eliezer Yudkowsky, very smart, futurists, they're barely scratching the surface of these. And they are very advanced too, to begin with, right? So in a sense, we're going to go very deep. We're going to be very deep. So hopefully you join me in this investigation. So I'm very excited. I'm very excited. So one last thing before we go through the camps is there's a key difference between negative and positive visions of the future. And there's a bit of a play of words here, because when somebody says, what is your negative, view of the future, you imagine what dystopias that you think are likely, or something like that. No, I'm using here the word negative as in like, they're testing for a disease and the result comes negative, meaning you don't have it. So what is a negative view of the future? Is basically a view of the future where you say, paradise should not have X. paradise shouldn't be X, and X might be something like it shouldn't have intense suffering. It shouldn't be a totalitarian state. It shouldn't have mind control. It shouldn't be completely stuck in a particular super narrow range of emotions or something like that. And if you dig deep, into ideas that people have, utopian ideas, something like communism and anarchism and any kind of high level conceptual framework that organizes a notion of what is a good future. If you dig deep into them, you will overwhelmingly see that they're actually negative views of the future disguised and presented as positive views of the future. Right? It's like, for example, I hate to mention this because it's obviously very controversial. People are still attached to these, I would describe, low-dimensional, low-grade visions of the future. But yeah, just as an example, something like Marxism or something is kind of the future shouldn't have, class struggle or something of that sort. It's kind of shouldn't have the bourgeoisie or shouldn't have, injustice, shouldn't have X, Y, Z. Sure, okay, what if we don't have that? Does that make it wonderful? No, it just, you're just like a tiny corner of possible badness in the universe that you have ruled out. And isn't it insane to base all of your worldview of and your visions of paradise around merely what you don't like? It's insane. It's kind of just complete and utter lack of imagination, not digging deep into what you could have. And oh my goodness, if you actually open your mind up to what you could have, there are some wonderful discussions to be had. But you require the adequate conceptual framework to actually dig into that. A very, very, very key one is, understanding that ultimately what matters, the source of value, is states of consciousness. Like that is where value bottoms out. It's the inherent, goodness or badness of the universe is determined by the goodness or badness of the experiences that inhabit that universe. So, talking only about modes of social organization or, even something like being free of pollution, back to nature, whatever it may be, they're all talking about the external physical world and how it's organized. And, David Pierce might describe all of those utopian visions as rearranging the deck chairs, which is, not getting to anything actually deep, if you see what I mean. So, in order to explore positive visions of the future, I actually compel you to open your mind to understanding the role of consciousness in the future. Not only, raw pleasure or something simple like that, low level, eating candy all the time or something like that, but actually understanding that experiences have a instrumental value because consciousness can be used for information processing. So just from that fact alone, clearly consciousness is very likely to play a very big role, if only as, part of a computational system. But two, consciousness also has intrinsic value. So Nick Bostrom might describe it as utopia resides in the space-time of awareness. That's where utopia is. It's not out there in the world. It's not, machines and robots or something like that. No, it's in the space-time of awareness. So now that we have clarified that, the question becomes, what do you want to fill the space-time of awareness with? Well, let's go through some fascinating visions. So first of all, what we call camp hedonism. And, this is kind of yacht parties and drugs and talking to very attractive people, going to very beautiful, festivals, eating a lot of beautiful food, very tasty food, experiencing perfumes, fancy perfumes, the good stuff of life or something like that. And let me tell you something. There's a lot of truth in this perspective because if you look at, there's controversy about whether this is good science or not, but if you look at what people regret in their deathbed, so to speak, no, not so to speak, literally, if you interview people who are about to die, what do you regret? They say things such as I shouldn't have taken myself so seriously, I shouldn't have worked that much. But above all, they say things like, I should have enjoyed myself more. was too caught up in the winds and currents of life, and I didn't stop to smell the flowers, or as it were, to go to the club and party. And honestly, yeah, for a lot of people, a very large percentage of people, maybe a majority of people, a lot of kind of like what makes their life maybe not as interesting is because they're not actively looking to expand, in a sense, their horizon of experiences. And a very beautiful insight that basically comes from Camp Hedonism is that value exists, and you better find it in the world. Go and get it. Be bold. Try it. Don't be completely shy and like miss out on opportunities. If somebody invites you to a weird party, go for it. There is a lot of value in that way of thinking. It knows a lot about the textures of experience. It's open. It's a very open to experience kind of a vibe, and that's great. That's beautiful. Actually, I think that any paradise worth its name will have a lot of that. We'll have like artists making amazing art, and you will have like chefs making amazing food, or whatever we evolved to consume, or basically these kind of like intense, beautiful qualities of awareness that can be cultivated and experienced. Yeah, all of that. We should have all of that. Now, there is a caveat, which is that in our current human vessel, as it were, well, there is this thing called hedonic adaptation. So yeah, I mean, if you go to one yacht party with very beautiful people and amazing music, and you network and it's awesome, that's great. But if you're doing that every week, nonstop, it's kind of like pushing the pleasure button, and then like nothing is happening at some point. And it gets a lot worse if actually you're talking about like, hardcore drugs like methamphetamine or heroin, things of that sort. They cause a lot of pleasure in the moment, but they do come at a very, very, very high health cost, and also hedonic habituation. So like if you actually plot how good they are over time, they tend to be net negative, especially if you use them a lot. Again, moderation is key. So if you can have moderation and kind of be rational about it, Camp Hedonism is great. And if you think about it, honestly, that's that is like what people tend to imagine in a lot of cases as paradise. Now, maybe the corresponding Buddhist realm that we might ascribe to these, which is maybe describing more kind of the negative quality of this camp, is hungry ghost. And hungry ghost is this feeling of things not being enough. Like, you had a meal and you feel, that was good, but I just need a dessert. Or, you had like a little bit of like some drug or something. And it's like, I feel good, but I should just have a little bit more. And Romeo Stevens from QRI, he describes it as people in the hungry ghost realm are kind of like, they feel that they need like 50% more all the time. And it really doesn't go away. And the thing is that, yeah, with things like hard drugs, a lot of, partying and like typical pleasure-seeking activities for humans, that builds up and you end up becoming a hungry ghost. So yeah, I mean, if you go to a rave or something and you go to kind of like the in crowd, chances are a lot of the time at the party, they're in a hungry ghost state of consciousness, which sucks. I mean, really. That's not a way to treat your mind, your consciousness, fill it up with a hungry ghost qualia. So, yeah, and hungry ghost, it's very sneaky. It sneaks up on you, and like you don't realize how much of your experience is hungry ghost until it's kind of like too late in a way. And also it can entrap you really hard, in a very, very hard way, because basically it makes you compulsively do the things that feed the hungry ghost consciousness too. So that's very important to be avoided. So what is to be done? Well, let's go on to the second vision of paradise, which is camp psychiatry. Now, this may, I don't know, it sounds kind of scary, but camp psychiatry, what are the core insights of camp psychiatry? So first of all, is the recognition that we are pretty bad at taking care of ourselves. That humans, I mean, like humans are, yeah, kind of like like pets in a way. Like we don't realize the extent to which, for example, whether we eat very, very bad food has to do with the fact that there's junk food just right there, just there. Or, drug abuse, like becoming an alcoholic because there's beer in your house. You have access to it, that sort of thing. Camp psychiatry knows that. It's kind of like one step above in that it recognizes, there's the kind of proximal and distal desires. There's the first order and second order desires. And we should cultivate more of the second order. And it's not only about like what you want right now, it's about what you want to want. What is it that if you could want, it would be good for you? How can you make it so that you actually want to eat salad, for example? Like I'm making really good salads and things like that. The other thing too, very big insight, is area under the curve. That, if you plot your hedonic tone after you take methamphetamine or something like that, you will see kind of a very big spike and then a drop and then like negative, and, you're going to be negative. And, especially if you've been using it before, it will be a net negative. Like the integral of this curve will give you a negative result. So those activities are actually just making you more miserable, all things considered. And camp psychiatry knows this. I mean, like that's what they look for. They look for like, okay, what is the net contribution of this? Now, very importantly though, what it really doesn't know is that there's actually much more valuable states of consciousness than, kind of just the kind of normalizing aesthetic of camp psychiatry, where basically the way in which it tends to work is like, well, you're presented with people who have very serious disorders or maybe mild disorders, and then the point is to kind of like normalize them and get them to be like, productive members of society, and like, sure, maybe like happy and so on, but intense happiness is not necessarily celebrated, and it might actually be viewed with suspicion as, for example, like a manic episode or something like that, or hypomanic. You're seeming too happy. Let's give you some antipsychotic or something to kind of like level you out. And that's a big loss, because actually baseline human happiness can go way higher than just the normal becoming a productive member of society. So that's important to consider. I will also point out that, an advantage of camp psychiatry is economies of scale, which is that one thing is to kind of like ask help from a friend who, maybe has a full-time job and a family and does other things. So like, listening to you is kind of like this one-off, like special thing, and they don't necessarily have like specialized knowledge on that. Whereas, somebody who does this for a living, like day in, day out, like hour after hour consulting with people, they will have a very good intuitive model of like where your problem lies, simply because of the scale of it. And likewise, like if you seriously want to, in a sense, provide a new therapy to humans in a way that will actually scale, it makes sense to actually do it through some kind of like specialized profession like psychiatry. So that's good. Now the Buddhist realm that we might associate with kind of like the negative part of this camp would be the animal realm. And the animal realm is basically, the state of consciousness that develops when you become very comfortable with kind of like your everyday life. And it's kind of like territorial. It's not ambitious or anything. It just kind of like wants to preserve its, you could say, mediocre way of life in a way. And that's a big risk. And, so many people end up, in a sense, kind of stuck in the animal realm, working at a job they don't like for years and years and years, because the gravity well of it is too deep. It's very difficult to kind of jitter yourself out of it. And camp psychiatry, I don't think it's very good at that. I think it's if you are in a worse realm, like that's an improvement. It can give you an improvement, but it's not the ideal. So the kind of aesthetic condensation of the negative side of camp psychiatry is muzak and potatoes, which is in a sense from the repugnant conclusion from Derek Parfit, which is anyway like a fun reference. But the point is like muzak being kind of elevator music, just like this very, very, very boring music. is just barely pleasant, just barely worth listening to, and like eating just unspiced potatoes or something like that. It's like, yeah, this is fine. It's okay. It's an okay experience. You're not suffering, but also you're actually missing out on so much. So what is to be done? Well, let's move on to the next one, which is Camp Wholesome. Camp Wholesome. So yeah, I mean, like, not in a super stereotypical tropey way, but yeah, I mean, rainbows and heart and good vibes. So a very important thing is, a lot of people underestimate the power of love, because one thing is to kind of like take love, casually, and maybe expect the world to give it to you, to generate it for you. Another very, very different thing is having kind of a systematic approach where you're cultivating it as much as possible. You're cultivating a heart-centered way of looking at the world and feeling and interacting with it. And that is beautiful. That is beautiful. So, for example, there's lots of reports that I have received of, like, yeah, if you do like loving kindness meditation, something like 1 hour a day, for example, for an entire month or longer, and you take a psychedelic at that point, your psychedelic experience is going to be just so much more beautiful and loving, because yeah, this beautiful consonant metronome that you've been cultivating will really come to the surface, and it can be so moving and healing. And in a sense, it is true that love heals all wounds. It is true. The problem is that love doesn't last for very long in most circumstances. But if you can kindle it, if you can keep it going, that is a massive improvement to one's life, like enormous. So much higher of an improvement to life than taking Prozac, taking antidepressants, or perhaps I would equate it with kind of like doing a lot of exercise, and actually even more than that. Like taking seriously the cultivation of loving kindness and the Brahma Viharas, which would be kind of the extension of that, the divine abodes. Beautiful, fantastic. Let's do it. This aesthetic also has kind of this notion of listening to your body, which the camp psychiatry doesn't. So you take antidepressants and you have lots of nausea, and like you feel that this is kind of toxic in some strange way to your body. You explain that to the psychiatrist, and they say, like, that's normal. That's just the side effects of this particular drug. It's gonna go away, or it might go away, and don't worry about it, or just like accept that that's like part of the deal. And oftentimes, your judgment of like how good actually this is for you, it's correct. And like, sometimes if you feel sick, actually very often, I would say, if you feel sick from psychiatric medication, it's probably something you should really be listening to. So yeah, paying attention to your body and how it feels, and kind of like treating all of your organs and treating all of your components with a lot of love. It's very, very important. And it really pays off. It pays off. However, this aesthetic does have some side effects when it's taken to the extreme. And the thing is that for a lot of people, this is the most advanced vision of paradise and goodness that they can have. And the failure modes are actually pretty extreme, pretty stark, very neurotic, very unpleasant, and should be avoided at all costs. So I'll just mention a few. First, this aesthetic tends to be enumerate, like just not care about numbers and quantities, which is just a huge problem, because the effect that you have in the world, depending on what you do, the effect size is distributed along a very long tail distribution, and this is kind of the whole idea of effective altruism, that you should actually take into account numbers and quantities. Super simple, right? This should be elementary school. But somehow you have like super well-funded charities, super, very prestigious, with, professors on the board of directors and whatnot. And they're not even actually trying to compute the cost effectiveness of what they're doing, and they might describe something as like number of people served as kind of like a metric rather than like, something that actually matters, like like, quality adjusted life years, or like amount of time spent in super unpleasant states of consciousness, measured, per dollar that you might be able to prevent or anything of that sort. Camp Wholesome doesn't process that very well. It's very strange, but basically kind of just having a heart-centered aesthetic makes you be very suspicious of numbers, and it makes you feel that as like cold and calculating, which is completely messed up and total BS. So like, don't fall for that. That's just such a huge failure mode. So common and resilient. It's also dissonant with kind of like what works. So like, if it turns out that the particular modes of organization, particular even like, circuit layouts or something like that, they don't look like they have kind of this kind of a, fundamental fairness and a sense of unity and love and so on. If they don't have kind of that, if they don't pattern match to that, Camp Wholesome will experience it as dissonant. And that's a problem, because actually a lot of the things that work actually work kind of in a way that is completely independent of like whether they follow Camp Wholesome. And the next camp actually kind of like takes that further. But I would say maybe the worst kind of like part of the Camp Wholesome is that it allows you to smuggle a lot of shadow into your thinking and strategizing, in that like, in a sense, you may have kind of like some like sociopathic tendencies unchecked because you justify it in the name of love, for example. So like power dynamics and things of that sort that are actually really damaging, may be, justified within the framework of like, well, the other people lack empathy, the other people lack compassion, they are potentially sociopaths or potential psychopaths or something like that. But it is, you've got to understand, this is like a very low resolution, very low dimensional aspect of that aesthetic, and is really, really messed up and messy. And unfortunately, I think that underlies just like so much value destruction, where basically kind of this top-down imposition of, whatever the current cultural ideas of what, love and compassion should look like, basically influences how things work on the low level. And I think that's like, it tends to be hugely disruptive. So not good. If I were to kind of map it onto a Buddhist realm, it would be the God realm or the Deva realms, because, in Buddhism, they don't have a creator god. They have a pseudo creator god. They have a high level Deva or god who believes it's a creator of the universe, but actually isn't, Brahma. But basically they do have this notion of beautiful realms of experience where if you're reborn in there, you will live for millions of years, and it's so full of love and, unconditional beauty, unconditional love. In order to get there, you need to do a lot of good deeds in your life. You have to have a very clean soul. You have to cultivate compassion and the divine abodes, sympathetic joy and love and compassion. All of those, if you're very diligent, you put a lot of energy into them, they would say you might be reborn in a Deva, in a God realm. And even in this life, you will live in kind of like a godly, divine, beautiful, loving vibe. And that's extremely valuable. But, in the Buddhist realms, actually, they also talk about a lot of the side effects that happen in the God realm. I actually posted a quote from this book in quality computing called Traps of the God Realm, which is in the description. And yeah, basically, the God realm tends to be pretty delusional, actually. Like, it's completely disconnected from like any understanding of like suffering and its nature and its quantity and its causal underpinnings. It just ignores it. It kind of like imagines that it already made it. It's already pure. It's already godly. It's in heaven. Whereas like, no, everything is impermanent. It doesn't matter how much loving kindness, etc. you cultivate. You've cultivated a finite amount of merit. You've cultivated a finite amount of it. It's not like a final, release. It's not a final solution. It really isn't. And the God realm doesn't know that. The entities in the God realms, so to speak, they believe that this is eternal. They believe this is forever. And they have tales of, like, for example, how towards the end of your lifespan as a deva in the God realms, you start to actually decompose, and all of, it used to be that you exude beautiful smells, but now you exude repulsive smells, and you exhausted all of your good karma. You will die, and you will probably be reborn in a very low realm because you don't have any good karma left. And that is a problem. So in practice, Camp Wholesome has that issue that it's often like weaponized and used in kind of like with a big shadow, used with a big shadow, and also is delusional. It kind of has like poor models of how the world works. It has poor models of how to even maximize itself. It's very complacent. It's not good in all of those ways, but it does have some beautiful insights that we should take and carry with us as we continue on this journey of advanced visions of paradise. So what is the next one? The next one is Camp Paleo, which sounds very silly for connecting visions of paradise with kind of a paleo aesthetic. But yeah, this is not not talking. I mean, maybe I'm referencing. Okay, like we should probably use a little bit of kind of understanding of evolutionary or evolutionary history in order to determine what's optimal nutrition and things of that sort. But Camp Paleo goes much deeper when it comes to its aesthetic. And I'll mention a couple of things. Like first, it's like very cognizant of super stimuli. Like it recognizes that like we evolved to basically be in a place that is like much more sensorially deprived. There's this meme or joke of like a single Dorito contains more nacho flavor than a peasant in the 1500s would like experience throughout the entirety of their life. And that probably does something to us. It kind of like resets our expectations and pleasure thresholds, and again like the hedonic habituation and the hedonic treadmill comes to mind again. And Camp Paleo is very aware of that. So like they basically are very mindful of super stimuli. And that's great. That's fantastic. They're also very mindful of optimal nutrition, optimal sleep discipline, and things of that sort. But also understanding human incentives and human nature, and like not being delusional or in denial about it. And I would say that there's like a beautiful marriage between Camp Paleo and Camp Wholesome, where basically you are trying to maximize love while also understanding that people follow incentives, and that the animal self has strong constraints that oftentimes is not willing to compromise on. And that said, that as kind of a evolution of an aesthetic that incorporates these elements can be good. Independent of each other, they have like they lack some important perspectives and understandings. Camp Paleo also has kind of like healthy skepticism of completely new interventions. So like doing large interventions in yourself or in the world that are like completely new relative to our evolutionary past. Like it's gonna be very skeptical of that, and that's good. It's actually good that there are people who are very skeptical of any large effect size intervention, and it would be like much more cautious. So like rather than trying to like create paradise by kind of like trying to change culture, Camp Paleo would be much more of the opinion that we should, in a sense, try to create a beautiful seed that really, does incremental changes in a somewhat cautious way, so that like in a sense we don't mess with things that we don't know about. So yeah, there's this concept of kind of a Chesterton's fence, and to be actually pretty explicit about the fact that if you remove human incentives, normal human incentives, usually things don't work. So that's important to take into account. Now, I will say that it does have a couple side effects, which is that it may have some blind spots, and Camp Paleo, in a sense, like may not really understand to some extent that like there might be some aspects of human nature potentially. I don't know. This is a hypothetical, but like there might be aspects of human nature that may make it so that we are like a danger to ourselves no matter what, and like things such as, you know, like mutually assured destruction as a kind of game theoretically stable equilibrium for like things like nuclear weapons and things like that. It may be that human nature is actually incompatible with being able to do, you know, use that kind of technology responsibly. And in that sense, Camp Paleo might be a little bit too romantic about like how far you can go with human nature, which is something that, yeah, I mean, I think kind of a bit of a transhumanist vision can complement that, so that you recognize like, yes, there's a lot of good in human nature. Human nature is, you know, this very incredible thing that out of this insane level of, you know, red in tooth and claw Darwinian selection pressures, we created something that is not completely terrible. You know, like humanity is like a pocket of goodness to quite an extent relative to the horrors of Darwinian life in a broader sense. And that's very, very important to recognize and be very mindful of and honor and respect without like doing too many modifications. But also, let's not be too romantic about it. Let's understand that, you know, human nature can also take us to hell, which is the dark side of paleo. I would say maybe hell realm to some extent, because it's an aspect of human nature is cruelty, and with cruelty taken all the way for example, maximizing power or something like that, yeah, we can expect pretty bad stuff happening. Which is why it's so important to bring to the table Camp Wholesome and the other perspectives. So let's move on. Camp Energy is camp number 5. So here's the elevator speech, the ad for Camp Energy, which is that, hey, like a lot of activities that we do, we don't realize it, but they build up gunk. And gunk is a very broad category, but roughly speaking, there's like a lot of aspects of our nervous system that you might describe as gunky. That, like, for example, if you are hungover, you might experience kind of like a weird viscosity in your nervous system, or some kind of like unpleasant tension, anxiety, or whatever we may call it, and that's gunk. Or you eat a lot of junk food, and over time, like, you feel kind of like disconnected from your stomach, and like there's some things happen that makes it so that like things don't flow, energy doesn't flow. There's a lot of blockages, so that's gunk. And gunk can be generated because of like food, because of like drugs, taking recreational drugs. It can be generated by actually like reading or watching very low quality like media and aesthetics, like just things that basically build up kind of physiological stress, things like social stress even, or feelings of meaninglessness, anything like that will accumulate gunk over time. So what can we do about it? There is one weird trick to get rid of your neuronal gunk, which is apply energy in a judicious way. I made a mistake, actually, which was that hell was associated with Camp Energy. Whereas, actually, Camp Paleo was Titan. Apologies about that. Camp Paleo might be Titan, in the sense that, like, the main side effect is that, the escalatory dynamics, which is cruelty, and cruelty combined with power. That could be like, the negatives of the Titan realm. Hopefully I didn't say anything too confusing, but yes, apologies about that. The negative of Camp Energy is the hell realm, because when you intensify the energy of your experience, you experience things more deeply. There's more it's a multiplier for valence, effectively. And in that sense, feeling a stomach ache can be bad. Feeling a stomach ache while on 5-MeO DMT can be hellish. So basically, any technique that uses high levels of energy for treating your nervous system has the potential to be hellish. Which is why, really, anything that intensifies energy, you should treat it as sacred. Really, I mean, like LSD, psilocybin, intense meditation, jhanas, like stages of insight, temporal lobe seizures, all of those things. I mean, not that you would give yourself a temporal lobe seizure as a treatment. Well, I guess electroshock therapy, but well, anyway, you should consider these kind of like sacred activities because they have the potential to be hellish and they have the potential to be heavenly. And I guess, sorry, I got distracted by my confusion, and again, apologies about that. But yeah, camp energy, there's a common thread among all of the following things, which is sauna, psychedelics, cold showers, yoga, meditation, breathing, exercising, art, intense art experiences, ecstatic experiences. What is the common thread in all of these things? It's energy. Is that they are all energy enhancing activities. Art, because of novelty. Novelty generates, gives rise to energy. And I mean it quite literally. I mean, there's the interpretation from the free energy principle, unexpected things increase, free energy, which is a computational level account. Here, I actually talk about like physically, like the sum total of the energy of your harmonic modes in your brain. I do think it increases with like all of these activities. And that's important. That actually does something. What does it do? It's power washing your nervous system. And that gets rid of gunk. Very related to, kind of like this perspective that when you activate the harmonics, you're in a sense like equalizing components of your nervous system and getting them to resonate with one another. And that process shakes off the gunk. It's something that you can feel. The phenomenon in meditation of purifications. In this frame, they would be, in a sense, de-gunking your nervous system. And it's, phenomenologically, it actually feels like you're breaking apart some kind of like mud substance that is coagulated. And yeah, being depressed might be very related to having a lot of that. Kind of like having this huge kind of like Play-Doh encasing your body and making it very viscous, So camp energy knows how to deal with that, and that's awesome. Again, you have to be very judicious. You have to know how to apply the energy to de-gunkify your nervous system in a net positive way, and there's a whole art to that, and hopefully also a science as we develop these visions further. There is one problem though, which is that it's not aware of the underlying causal reasons why this works. I mean, from the point of view of camp energy, this is alchemy. And you do have a lot of people who are kind of implicitly, they have a camp energy aesthetic, yoga teachers or, psychedelic facilitators, advanced meditators. They tend to have kind of a camp energy aesthetic, which is pretty surprising because it kind of like gets out of the typical, cultural views that we have about paradise, and it also gives them a deeper understanding of basically ethical priorities, because they, if you have access to high energy states of consciousness often in a way that doesn't damage you and actually heals you, well, yeah, you recognize that they are hyper valuable in a way. They become kind of the center point of your life, the thing that gives a spice to your life. And an analogy that Mike Johnson was giving in the neuroscience of meditation was, if you have kind of a tuning fork that it has like mud in it, hitting it and hitting with a lot of energy and making it resonate at its own resonant frequency will shake off the mud. And the mud at first is damping it, but the more you hit it, the more it shakes it off, and eventually it becomes kind of like, rather than, biking uphill, the feeling is that of biking downhill. So there's stream entry in meditation, like after which, apparently like meditation is much more fun. It actually feels kind of easier to do because you have kind of this momentum, and in a sense you've mostly shaken off the mud, rather than like every time I hit it with energy, it just doesn't resists. It doesn't want to move. Okay, so so that's camp energy, but it doesn't have a deep understanding of the causal structures. This is alchemy from the point of view of camp energy, and as I said, it's shadow side, its dark side would be hell. And I would say, there are like groups of people who only use kind of camp energy as their aesthetic. Maybe there's some cults, maybe even some sex cults have kind of this aesthetic implicitly. It can be very hellish, because then, if you think that the solution to any problem is just like some kind of energetic work, well, in many cases it doesn't work, and it's extremely unpleasant and maybe traumatizing to an extent that it wouldn't be if you weren't playing with energy. So that's important to keep in mind. It's not the end all be all, and it doesn't understand itself in a sense. It's alchemical, magical. So what is it that we should do given this, the next vision? And now we're going very deep. I mean, I think like this kind of like level of analysis is really not present anywhere else as far as I can tell. So the next camp, number 6, is camp self-organization. And here is where you do have kind of this desire, these arrows attached to causal structures, that you actually want to understand, okay, why does energy, why does it allow you to get rid of energy blockages? And why does that, connect to hedonic tone and feeling good? Well, in camp self-organization is where you actually, model, for example, the brain as a weighted sum of connected harmonics, and maybe their nonlinear interactions as well. You understand things holistically, but not in a cheap, spiritual way of like, oh, everything is connected. But no, in a much, much deeper sense, in the sense of like, hey, how does a lot of tiny building blocks working in the same way give rise to emergent large-scale behavior? What is that process? What kind of like tiny circuits of self-organization, when tiled, would give rise to a collectively beneficial behavior? That is the sort of thing that camp self-organization is thinking about. It's not trying to, figure out like an aesthetic to impose on everybody. Not at all. This is transcending that kind of approach. Instead is figuring out what kind of like low-level self-organizing principles, when scaled up, gives rise to the good and beautiful, ultimately cashing out in states of positive valence. But also, basically what kind of self-organizing principles are better for example, better communication, better flow, better dissipation of energy, better, buildup of energy, and also, for example, diversity of patterns or evolutionary dynamics. What kind of self-organizing principles give rise to good evolutionary selection pressures? Like, all of that is what camp self-organization really, really cares about. I would mention, the free energy principle would be kind of like in this space also neural annealing, the work that Mike and I have spent a lot of time on. Buddhist annealing basically is kind of Buddhism from the lens of camp self-organization, you could say. And I would definitely include like the symmetry theory of valence as well, in the sense of like it's a whole account of like how we can, in a sense, quickly and in a massively parallel way with holistic field behavior identify whether an organism is in a good state or not, as a function of basically whether it's is in a consonant state. And that is principles of self-organization. The whole aesthetic that analyzes, for example, DMT trips as an excited world sheet that then has energy sinks either through recognition, like Bayesian energy sinks, or through symmetries. So that like the things that you experience on DMT tend to be hybrids of semantic content and symmetrical configurations. All of that is the aesthetic of the camp self-organization. And the truth is, we haven't even begun exploring this. This is a very large topic, and it's definitely not yet, connected with kind of like understanding positive and negative valence and ways in which you can actually use states of consciousness for various purposes. And, camp self-organization is not going to describe, your weird DMT trip or, your weird experience in terms of like, oh, was this, like kind of like another dimension, or was this kind of a different wavelength or something like that. They may actually talk about it in terms of like, which of the self-organizing principles in the periodic table of self-organizing principles are being used as the building blocks of that experience. And it may very well be that in a sense you can describe a lot about a person in terms of like very low level self-organizing principles that give rise to emergent personality behaviors. And I mean, something that Mike, for example, was pointing out is that, if somebody's very greedy, to give an example, that may not only be a psychological connection, a condition, it may, in a sense, like be the reflection of what self-organizing principle the entire body, the entire system is using. So maybe if you're really greedy, it's not only that, you act to kind of like get more and more and more compulsively without feeling, satisfied. It may also be that your kidney works that way, or maybe your heart or your lung, it also has kind of those problems. Maybe they're also greedy about basically the glucose or the oxygen in the body. And imagine if you have like a lot of like greedy organs, all of them just trying to kind of like play a zero-sum game. The organism deteriorates way faster than maybe if you have something where like all of the organs are actually just trying to make the other organs as happy and healthy as possible, where there's like synergy and there is a positive sum game that happens that ultimately gives you something much more than the sum of the parts. Self-organizing principles may cut really, really deep, and there's also most likely a huge range of possible alloys of self-organizing principles that give rise to completely different outcomes. The Buddhist realm I would associate with the camp self-organization is the human realm. And the human realm basically is this desire to understand everything. The picture that they use in opening the heart of compassion. Yeah, I mean, basically, studying, field behavior, self-organizing principles, understanding, your DMT experience in that lens, and all of that. Well, there is a catch to it. It's good. It allows you to navigate it better. It makes you less flabbergasted because you don't know what's going on. But also, it does have the negative psychological effect of closing you up to the mystery of reality, the very deep mystery. And the truth is that all of this is still just like scratching the surface. And that the moment in which you truly buy into an aesthetic for reals, and you think that it explains everything, you have closed so many doors of experience, so many perspectives, ways of seeing. A huge loss. So yes, you should use, the human realm in order to make as good of a map of reality, but also understanding that if you're always only in that realm, you will be closing yourself up to whole realms of experience. And in a sense, like dampen your sense of mystery, which is an important ingredient for continuing to explore and understand reality. So that is the side effect. It's not a terrible side effect. I mean, it's not as bad as, I guess, camp energy, where the side effect is, I don't know, it might be you get a bad 5-MeO DMT trip or something horrifying like that. Being closed off to the mystery is not that bad. Maybe the arrogance that comes with thinking you understand how societies work and things like that, and you're playing kind of a technocratic role. Maybe that also has like side effects, but I think like from the point of view of self-organization, I think you can build a pretty compelling case that it's applying the right lens, that is self-correcting ultimately. I mean, like if that is the level of analysis, rather than just being guided by your aesthetic blindly, I think it's can overcome a lot of its own problems. A coral reef would be maybe a beautiful metaphor for self-organization and what it's capable of. Kind of like lots of little tiny modules pursuing their own self-interest, and as a consequence, you end up having kind of this beautiful hyperbolic, self-organizing system. And likewise, when we think of paradise, maybe we shouldn't think of like, what are we going to do once we win? And like everybody does whatever we want or something like that. We should think about like, what kind of circuits, what kind of like principles of self-organization would actually scale up in a graceful way without like only being, for example, tiling the universe with something beautiful or something like that. Is more like, how do we make a dynamic system that is like resilient and anti-fragile at every scale? I guess I'll just mention also, yeah, definitely free energy principle is here. There's also kind of the principle of maximal flow. Also, I would put it here. Anti-tolerance drugs, kind of like understanding that there's like feedback systems in the nervous system, and that like maybe we can in a sense get rid of chronic pain by combining an opioid agonist together with an anti-tolerance drug, like maybe the evolution of ibogaine once we get rid of heart side effects and things like that. Yeah, that would be kind of the self-organizing aesthetic too. Basically, is how do we fiddle with the parameters, the gain, and the precision of synapses in order to, in a sense, prevent the buildup of tolerance or something like that. Even just natural hedonic habituation. How do you prevent that? It may actually not be like drugs in the end. It may be something else, like using transducers at the precise moment within a meditation session or something like that. Who knows? But basically the lens that like we've had to understand the cybernetic feedback systems within our entire organism and fiddle with them very carefully, but in their own terms, such that what emerges is something that is very, very valuable. Which takes me to the final one, which is Camp Paradise Engineering. And this is the symbol of Camp Paradise Engineering. Let me take a sip of water. So this is where it gets extremely deep. And honestly, I cannot make justice to this cluster of ideas. You would have to listen to them while on samadhi for them to truly make sense. And this is a very key component that, similar to like the 6 Buddhist realms, that you can only really understand what they are and in what way they're kind of like sneaky attractors that, in some sense, like block your ability to perceive further. The only way to do that is to be outside of them, to disidentify with them, and to know that an aesthetic is not you. That when you marry with an aesthetic, you are, in a sense, embodying it. And whatever goes against it feels like an attack, which is crazy. That's a very crazy side effect. But that's how we tend to work. So Camp Paradise Engineering is aware of that. It's aware of all the realms. It's aware of all of these different aesthetics. And I would perhaps describe it as the aesthetic of the meta aesthetic, where it looks at all of these different ideas and ideological frameworks and makes alloys out of them without at any point getting wrapped up into them and buying their vision entirely, but also without dampening them. In a sense, like being able to experience all of these different visions with a lot of equanimity and let their updates propagate through your system, but without allowing them to get a grip on you. And I think that aesthetic will serve us a lot. And an example of this is how an openness and fluidity to perspectives on personal identity influence our visions of paradise. That we should recognize that given our current state, given our current learnings, our intelligence, our access to experiences, and so on, that there's a lot to learn. There is a whole lot to learn, and it's silly to make any kind of final picture for the time being. That we really should like further the science of consciousness a lot more before basically before we're willing to be bold about like precise visions, precise ideas. And instead, what we should be doing is laying out the groundwork so that we have all of the ingredients available to us to construct beautiful visions that we don't get wrapped up into. So I would maybe make an analogy with kind of like Buddha lands or Pure Lands, places where you go to learn. Ultimately, you go to awaken. But in a sense, to play at that level, you have to have gone through many stages, and it's a very high level to play at, because you need to, in a sense, not be prey to your previous aesthetics. And that is so difficult. I don't know the percentage of people who are there, but I would imagine it's very, very low. It's kind of a Keegan level 5 type of approach to reality. For those of you who are familiar with Keegan's levels of development. And there's so few people theorizing at that level. And I think we really need it. I mean, there's a lot of people kind of selling solutions, or just, raising up their hands and saying they don't know. But not kind of these like nuanced analyses with all of these perspectives taken together as different ways of seeing. But we can make a lot of progress, I think, on that level. And I'll just like share a couple things. I've made videos about this, but it's worth reminding you. Consciousness versus replicators is an important frame here. That like there's no kind of like the good and the bad guys. That's kind of like a bad low dimensional framework that, again, from Camp value, you will have to recognize that like as soon as you define like the good and the bad, it kind of like activates some like pretty primal emotions in you, which distort your thinking and allow you to make coalitions based on that. But what is the point of making coalitions based on something that's not true, or something that is just like very partial, a very low dimensional approximation, underfeeding reality? That's not good. That's not good. And I think like part of the aesthetic of the meta aesthetic is recognizing the ways in which aesthetics give rise to various kinds of fanaticism, various kinds of closed-mindedness, being very aware of them and cognizant and feeling it in your body and really, really understanding it. Instead, something like consciousness versus replicators, where like ultimately we're all on the same team. We're all on the same side. Whether we realize it or not, we're in team consciousness. There's kind of gradients to how much we realize it. But we can play as a one team, actually, to the extent that we realize that. And we can identify, in a sense, the dangers as coming from replicators out of control. From, viruses, all the way to like ideologies, all the way to, perhaps like robots that we might create, or algorithms that might be really good at making copies of themselves. And from that point of view, there's no identification. There's no commitment to a particular view of your identity that ought to be preserved. And in fact, the whole feeling, the whole desire for something that ought to be preserved is then reinterpreted as kind of a replicator strategy. Perhaps an important ingredient in anything that will pragmatically able to replicate itself, but very, very dangerous when unchecked, when not understood as what it is. Perhaps when wrapped up within the shadow of like one of the visions, not only these camps, but whatever memeplexes there are in society. So by disidentifying with any particular pattern and recognizing that this is a kind of impermanent play of emptiness, using Buddhist metaphors, that clinging to it only makes it worse, it allows you to see reality more objectively and assess the pros and cons of the various states of consciousness that could be the building blocks, could be the inhabitants of the space-times of awareness of the utopia. So flexible sense of self. And flexible sense of self, yes, I mean, there's this fascinating thing where like, in some aesthetics, for example, a monotheistic aesthetic, there is this thing that you pray to, which is kind of this external creator God, for example. But then there's also, maybe kind of a transcendent Gnostic views of divinity, where maybe the thing you pray to is kind of a unity consciousness or something like that. And then there's maybe like within Buddhism and other religions like that, there's like, okay, maybe not even that, there's kind of emptiness or the state of neither being nor non-being or nirvana or something like that is like very, very transcendent, but ultimately not agentic. And then there's like things like, you know, like samadhi, or like states of super, super elevated energy that don't have a self. You know, they don't have a personality. So, I mean, I think we can make the case that they're important building blocks of paradise. And like, okay, maybe paradise is not like tiling the universe with, you know, little monks in samadhi or something like that. But maybe samadhi is like pointing towards, ultimately, like, what is this value that physics can produce? The one electron of the universe and all of its tangles. You know, what states does it prefer? And it's not a personal thing. You know, this is the craziest thing. Because like once you're kind of at this level of analysis where you're able to disentangle yourself from standard identity, it's kind of like you recognize that, you know, even kind of like the typical way in which somebody might have a relationship with the divine has built up assumptions about the self, has built up assumptions about reality. But if reality is like just so much more expansive, so much deeper and wider than any of that, then that feels all of a sudden kind of like a strange play, kind of an aesthetic that is very childish in a sense, almost childish, I would say. Because, you know, if the sense of self is a possible variable, you have to ask yourself, you know, if we are doing this for the universe, but then in the future there's no sense of self in the future, for example, that everything is like a post-samadhi society. There's no sense of self in the future. Who are we doing this for? There's no recipient. There's no imagined sense of self getting this as a benefit. So all of our programs, implicit assumptions of how, for example, favors are transferred, or goodness or karma is transferred, and so on, a lot of those are fabrications that rely on very deep inbuilt background assumptions about reality. And if you start questioning them, you realize that the visions of paradise you could have could be free of that. You could recognize them as fabrications and go deeper, explore a wider space. And it goes so deep, gets so crazy once you expand and vivify and energize these high-level visions that integrate, you know, all of the different camps that I've been talking about, while also remaining open to the mystery of reality. And I think that is a good way forward. I think that's a good space. That's a great place to inhabit. And it's very subtle. And right now, it's a seed that we are protecting and we are trying to give life to and nurture. And hopefully, you know, it can be something that ultimately, sprouts something very beautiful and blossoms. But for the time being, I wouldn't want to say it's any kind of complete vision. You know, we assume basics, like, you know, part of the negative view, the negative vision of reality of the future would be, you know, utopia clearly doesn't have intense suffering. That, you know, that's a constraint. I can't imagine really a utopia with intense suffering or factory farming or things like that. They're kind of a negative constraints, but that's not a vision of the positive side. Whereas I think playing with a very open mind with all of these concepts in kind of a high entropy alloy of consciousness, where you're open to, for example, how samadhi comes into the picture. There's so much juicy qualia, so much beauty of a very high level philosophical kind is so difficult to explain. Yes, so that's what excites me, what gets me up in the morning, and I definitely want to share that with all of you. So thank you very much for listening, and join me in imagining possible advanced visions of paradise. All right, infinite bliss, everybody, and may you have a wonderful, wonderful day, evening, whatever time it is. Take care.